Carmen reminds everyone a little of Shirley Bassey. Facially, that is, because she's tiny, whereas Bassey is what Ken would call womanly these days. But Carmen seems to have that brand of dramatic exuberance. Betty and I watched her out on Trevor's Drive yesterday morning. We do a fair bit of spying. Betty calls it neighbourhood watch. I call it voyeurism. Carmen was wearing a purple silk dressing gown with rather wonderfully a scarlet and gold cummerbund and lime green feathery slippers. Betty was agog, eyes like gobstoppers. She does make me laugh. Sometimes wish that Ken had a Betty. What stunned me most was the way Carmen strutted about, hands on hips, shouting demands at Lee Cochrane, the window cleaner. Ken and I hide when he comes, crawl about the house on all fours sometimes. He's got those spider's web tattoos and an eye on a chain round his neck. And ever since he spat phlegm on the bedroom window and left it to dribble down, Ken's been certain that he must be ex-Carnforth High and have it in for him. Ken's teaching practice in the 80s came to an abrupt end, but that's another story. We assumed Trevor had discovered Carmen in Cuba because he sent Bruce the vicar a postcard from Havana. And then 3 days ago, Carmen rolls up in a taxi and opens up Trevor's bungalow, the bordello, as Ken and I call it, now she's hung leopard skin in the windows. Rather fun to think of this elderly little patch as a red light district. Not that I dare suggest anything so frivolous to Betty. Betty's incurably literal. Trevor Latham has always been something of a dark horse. Women have appeared on and off ever since Ken and I retired here. All presentable and apparently human, and frankly it's a mystery how he does it. He's a salesman, something to do with chemicals. He travels a lot. One of those men who can spend an entire evening dictating the pros and cons of different motorway routes, or how to drive from Blackpool to Bear when you've had a skinful without bumping into the police. Ken says it's being shy with women that makes Trevor voluble. He's not so bad man to man. They share an interest in cameras. Ken's forever sending snaps of Robbins into the RSPB or Country File. No success so far. But when Trevor's around, he sometimes pops into the George for a quick one to pick up tips. I imagine they discuss the pros and cons of different shutter speeds. He's always careful to leave before Trevor gets tanked up, though. The funny thing is, Trevor's been away for weeks now. If he's come back home on the quiet, there's no sign of him. Ken and I have rather naughtily discussed the possibility of Carmen having done him in. I wouldn't dream of saying that to Betty, though. In a world of beige brick, Carmen brightens the view, and today she actually tottered over and knocked on our door. Close up, I think she could be older than Trevor, but she was sporting an array of bling Tutankhamun would have been proud of. I shouldn't mock, though. Quite apparent she was upset. Offered her a coffee, asked how she was settling in, and she perched her bum on the settee and started winding a piece of her lovely hair round her finger, and she said, "Not good." And then her eyes filled up. She bit her lip, and she said she had an awful secret. I felt my stomach clench. Couldn't look at Ken. Turns out Carmen met Trevor years ago and they're married. I said he was a dark horse. They were going to live in a bungalow, but poor Carmen hated it. And she already had the beauty salon in Blackpool, so they settled for weekends together in her flat over the business. She kept begging Trevor to sell up, buy somewhere else, but he wouldn't. And then this spring, Carmen had a change of heart, decided to move in after all. Never told Trevor, wanted it to be a beautiful surprise. She arrived while he was out at work and had just put her old key in the lock when a blonde in a bath towel swung the front door open and asked what she wanted. Well, Carmen was mortified, pretended she got the wrong address. even yelled at the taxi driver to make it look more convincing. But she felt murderous towards Trevor. And like she said, the feeling just wouldn't go away. I glanced at Ken in the doorway. He was miming getting rid of her, whooshing handfuls of air towards the front door. I knew he was scared of what might come next, and certainly wouldn't want to be involved with the police. Ken failed his entrance test with the police in 1975. But I could hardly stop Carmen's flow during a confession. I almost wished Betty would appear. She's oddly calming in a crisis. At this point, Carmen leans over and grasped my hand. Her wrist was jangling golden cobras. Taking pity on Ken, I suggested he make some more coffee. Carmen started streaming tears, and I felt choked and sort of impotent, like you do. And my fingers started throbbing. Her rings were digging in so. And then she said, never breathed a word to Trev, not about the blonde. And then she slapped her free hand across her mouth. Ken came in with coffee and wagon wheels. I felt a brief stab of love. Only Ken could think wagon wheels might work now. Tried unsuccessfully to release my hand, a mistake. Carmen's grip tightened. Ken looked up from pouring the coffee and said, "Is that hurting you, Trish?" Carmen frowned at her hand as if she was bewildered and let me go. Ken cleared his throat. He'd obviously come to a decision. He said, "Where is Trevor, by the way?" I stared at him. Never known him to have such bottle. Then Carmen said, "There's something I have to show you." Ken swallowed and we both got up and we followed her out of the house and over the road, and we'd just reached Trevor's driveway when Betty called, "All right if I tag along," and came beetling across. So the three of us trooped into Trevor's house. I knew Betty ought to be warned, but what in the world could I say? At first, nothing seemed to be amiss. The lounge was looking rather colourful. Trevor's black leather suite had been covered in some zebra fabric and girly scatter cushions, and a giant sort of disco ball swung off the ceiling, and there was a distinct whiff of perfume about. I glanced at Carmen's satin thighs, the needle heels of her boots. From the back, she could almost pass for 35. She was standing by the door into the kitchen, and when she opened it, I knew what I needed to do. Grabbing Betty's arm, I dragged her back into the hall, asked her to go and fetch the vicar. I whispered, "Something dreadful's happened here. You might help Carmen." She looked at me in huge surprise. Betty doesn't always pick up on atmospheres. But she nodded and she set off. I went back. Ken was covering his face. He was saying, "Sorry, can't." The smell had changed. Febreze now, mixed with a peachy toilet disinfectant. And beneath it something reminiscent of a rotting fox Ken and I once found out on the estuary. The kitchen blinds were down. Bracing myself, I went in. The kitchen itself looked orderly and empty. The door of Trevor's dark room, a room I'd never set in before, was ajar. I followed my nose. The place glowed with a red light. I peered around. A large sink with a hose on the taps. Filing cabinets, kilder jars. But the odour now was almost overpowering and sort of gassy. The sort of smell that seeps through your pores. Sickening. Carmen was shuddering in front of something like a projector screen covering the end wall. Fighting bile, I said, "You okay?" Without a word, she pulled the cord and the screen rattled up to the ceiling. Neither of the two women staring fish-eyed from the aquarium behind bore any resemblance to Trevor Latham. Not as far as you could tell. Hard to be sure. This was an amateurish job, not a Damien Hirst. Judging by the fair hair, the one on the left could have been the young woman who seemed to be an item with him in the spring. The other one was quite beyond description. The cabinet was leaking, cracking, terrible secret pouring out. Carmen had obviously been spraying the crack with everything she could think of. She whispered, "Trevor's flying. He's coming home today." That was when I passed out on Trevor Latham's laminate flooring. Bruce the vicar never did get to comfort Carmen. The police got here first, and in the event, Carmen's only offence was in keeping Mum for a few stricken hours after finally breaking into Trevor's darkroom, and keeping Mum, I'm afraid, is horribly apt. The other body turned out to be her mother-in-law. Poor Carmen. No wonder Trevor wouldn't sell up when she met him. He had his half-mummified mother to think about. Couldn't risk removal men and transport. And it appears he strangled the girlfriend for Carmen's sake. When I suggested how sick this was to Betty, she said, "Suppose it's only the human equivalent of Ginger bringing me birds." You can't face old Betty. Ken and I are the only ones who know that until Carmen managed to break into the darkroom and discover her husband's artwork, she had at least half seriously been planning to murder Trevor. Must have been a terrible shock to discover what he'd already done himself. You could say Trevor's actions saved her, really. I was suggesting this to Ken last night in the kitchen as we were making eggy bread and cocoa. He said, "Would you mind very much if I went to visit Trevor in prison?" I stiffened. Said he could do what he liked. When I'd mulled it over a bit, I asked him why on earth he should want to. He said, "If it was Betty, you'd go, wouldn't you?" I was about to snap that would be entirely different, and I began to wonder if it would. Friendship's a funny thing.